Okay. Okay, we're live. Sorry about the technical problems. We're just going to give it a few minutes while people kind of rejoin here. I've got a live link here. Let's see if I can send this out. Okay, so the point of having this thing embedded in Liberty.me is that it allows chat. Otherwise, I don't think Google, great. I don't think Google Hangouts allows chat, so the point of embedded it, okay, there we go, is to allow chat. So I think we're good to go. I am so sorry for the confusions here. Let's see if I can get rid of. I was just thinking that, sorry about this, that we're kind of past, whoops, you can repost that if you want to. We're past the point in history where this kind of technology is just sort of amazing that it happens at all. Now it's actually got to happen really well. So I know myself, I've lost patience for technical difficulties on live chat. Like everything's got to be amazing, or else I want out. You know, history has gone so fast forward in the last 8 years. I watched a television show made in 2009 the other night, and the guy was at an office and he was stealing a piece of paper out of somebody's desk, and after he stole the piece of paper, he realized, of course, he needed a photocopy of it, but he didn't have an iPhone, right? So he had to find a copy machine within the office, and the copy machine wouldn't work without the code. So he had to, flirt with the secretary and get her to give him the code. So he puts the receipt on the copy machine, and then, was able to make a photocopy. But that was a very essential part of the plot. So it took, an extra 10 or 15 minutes, during which time he had to sneak around. This is in 2009, this show came out. A couple years later, all of humanity had practically, or a third of it anyway, had photocopy machines in their pockets. So no longer do we need the thing. All we have to do is take it out and shoot a picture. So that's how quickly all of our technology is moving. But it's actually very interesting because there's something about the nature of the human personality that there's never enough, right? If we get a glimmer of something wonderful, like a live chat that works perfectly, then we want it to work perfectly all the time. I've got a pop-up here that I'm trying to get rid of. If you'll just kind of ignore me for just 1 second. There we go. Okay. All right. So we're good to go, finally. All right. Tonight we're talking about a very exciting thing, and it's As We Go Marching, a great treatise by John T. Flynn. I find the subject of the book very interesting, just like I think the subject in general is interesting. The subject is the politics and economics of fascism as an ideology. It's a very interesting subject to me because mostly today the word fascism has been reduced to a kind of an insult, right? You call somebody a fascist. What does it mean? Maybe it means an authoritarian personality, overly officious, possibly a hint of racism, a tint of, tribal hatred, or, something we associate vaguely with right-wing, a controlling spirit in some way, that's embodied in some sort of collective aspiration. And so that's what we call fascism. But mostly we don't think there are real fascists in the world, We use it as an insult, and almost everybody would deny I'm a fascist. Unlike socialism, which is still, for some strange reason, considered to be, if you're a socialist, sort of charming and humanitarian and broad-minded, but fascist is self-evidently evil. And I would say that the reason for this is essentially that we, meaning the US, defeated fascism in World War II and vanquished it from the earth, right? So it no longer becomes a serious threat. It's just more of an insult. And I would say in many ways this is to discredit, or it's a discredit to what is actually a fairly systematic ideology that remains an ongoing threat to human liberty. And I would even suggest to you something that would sound implausible to you, which is that the fascist threat to human liberty is actually, and always has been, a much more of a mortal danger to the West than socialism has. Socialism never stood a serious prospect of being realized in the US. National industries were never going to be nationalized. Land would never be nationalized. The workers and peasants were never going to fully overthrow the bourgeoisie. Shopkeepers were never going to be entirely looted of their possessions, and socialism imposed. That was never a threat. But real live fascism, yes, it is a threat. I'm just changing my microphone, so forgive me if the audio changes. I just realized I had it set on the wrong microphone. Probably that's a better sound to you now than it was before. Okay. So now you might be thinking, well, why are you distinguishing between socialism and fascism? Isn't fascism itself a species of socialism, and shouldn't we lump them all in together? And there's a sense in which that's true. Certainly, as John T. Flynn moves through the ideology of fascism, and he really does deconstruct it in a beautiful way from the first chapter all the way to the last, deconstructs fascism as an ideology and points out that Mussolini himself, who in many ways is the statesman who originated the idea of fascism, himself had a syndicalist ideological sympathies in his youth, which are avowedly socialist of a certain type, favoring worker control of factories, still private property, but run by workers, anti-capitalistic, but and believing that value ultimately traces to labor, but not full-blown Marxian-style scientific socialism. Syndicalism is of a specific type of socialism. And that's true, that was the origin of his thought. But actually, as time went on, he realized that political success, in Italian politics in particular, and I would say this is true in European politics generally, because after all, fascism has made its full-blown appearance in many countries in the world, many different places, more countries probably than socialism. Spain, Chile, certainly Germany, Italy. I would say in the US, fascism was fully realized in the New Deal and in World War II economic planning. And probably still, remains the prevailing and really best term to describe the U.S. economic system today. So what is fascism and how is it different from socialism? So I would say that fascism is a particularly sort of right-wing variant of socialism. Now recall back when socialism was at the height of its theoretical sophistication, I guess you could say, in the late 19th century, say the 1880s, 1890s. What did socialism aspire to? It wasn't just about the abolition of private property, although that was an essential feature of socialism. There was all this other stuff associated with socialism that people found to be absolutely essential. One was the abolition of religion and the prohibition of the clerical class. A very important part of the socialist ideal, that we had to get rid of the clerics, and that something approximating atheism should be the official religion. Another was, and people have forgotten about this, the abolition of the family. This is something that the Soviets never even attempted. As far as I know, no modern experiment in socialism has ever attempted this. But the idea is that women would never be truly free until they could leave the subjugated state of marriage and wifery, which was a form of slavery, according to socialist mind, and that the family itself was an overly private institution, stood against the collective. It was impossible, so long as the family existed, to achieve perfect equality, since the various quality of parents. There's a natural inclination towards, some children being overly privileged as versus others. There's an inherent element of the division of labor in the family, so that one partner, would tend to do all the professional work, the other one would tend to do all the domestic work. This predictably would fall along gender roles, sexual lines, so that the professional would typically and historically be the man. Woman would be somehow relegated to the position of tending to the domestic life, and therefore not earning remunerative labor. All these things warred against the socialistic ideals of equality, so therefore the family was targeted in particular by what I would call left-wing socialism. So that was part of the agenda, not just the abolition of private property, but the abolition of the clerical class and people's traditional attachments to religion, and then also the abolition of the family and the collectivization of the rearing of children. These were critical factors. Now, in these respects, all three of these things are really a fundamental attack on what has emerged over the last 500 years, what we call bourgeois life. It really represents a foundational attack on all the things that people truly love. I mean, what do people really love in this life, in this world? They love their stuff, they love their religion, and they love their family, right? So you've got an ideology in left-wing socialism that says, oh, here's a great idea. Let's get rid of all the three things that people love the most: their stuff, their families, and their religious faith. Okay, so how much political success can you really hope to achieve under those conditions? Very rarefied conditions under which left-wing traditional scientific socialism of the Marxian variety actually succeeded. That happened in Russia because there was, mostly because of World War I and a hyperinflation that was taking place, and a great deal of agitation by the Leninists. And don't forget, the Bolshevik Revolution was not actually a revolution on behalf of scientific socialism in the Marxian sense. It was a pure revolution, coup d'etat, and only after the revolution did the great struggle between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks take place, in which the Mensheviks lost and the Bolsheviks won, and we saw war communism, which only lasted actually a handful of years under Lenin. Then they reverted back to, highly bureaucratized leftist style regime that bore very little, if any, resemblance to Marx's original plan. Other places where socialism won out were things, we obviously know about Cambodia, we know about Eastern Europe under the Soviets after World War II, China. These were all cases of emergency wartime conditions, very highly rarefied. Socialism didn't typically win in outright elections, at least not of the Marxian variety. There were usually emergency style circumstances that sort of seized the country in the event of some huge upheaval. But what if you have normal politics, where there's a dictator that really wants massive amounts of power to centrally plan the economy and achieve a completely hierarchically centralized regime under which the state was completely total and managing everybody's lives? What kind of ideology works under those conditions? Well, it was Mussolini's view, and it turns out, I think, quite correctly, was quite correct about this, but the variety of socialism
should actually be, to some extent, organic to the social order itself, which is to say it shouldn't attack the things that people love the most. It should permit them to have their property, it should permit them to have their religion, and it should permit them to have their families. In fact, under the traditional fascist style economic system, a family is not abolished. In fact, it's heralded and considered like a central pillar of the political culture itself. Something the state would guard and protect and even establish and guarantee, intensify, and entrench. And there you get the bourgeoisie rallying around it. Yes, there are lots of threats to the family. We must support the family. The state must support the family. So fascism has always been about family politics. It's always traditionally been pro-religion. Let's not forget that Mussolini himself was very supportive at some level of Catholicism, insofar as, but he just wanted that religion to serve the state. I mean, if you go to Rome today, you can see that the piazza at the Vatican, the big road leading up to St. Peter's, was entirely built by Mussolini with government funding. I mean, it actually has a kind of fascist feel to it, actually, with big symbols of power, marble everywhere, big state, Roman style, Roman imperial style architecture and that sort of thing. I mean, Mussolini himself had a tense but ultimately sympathetic relationship with the Catholic Church. So that style of fascism under which he rose to power was not antagonistic to religion. In fact, it used religion in the service of statism, actually. And similarly with the whole issue of private property, fascism never sought to abolish it. It just sought to regulate it and turn its use over towards national purposes. So under fascism, you see this uniting take place of labor, the big labor unions, which come to be controlled entirely by the state, with large corporate powers, which become cartelized and heavily regulated. And they work together with other large industries to form a kind of new ruling class, including the banks, the largest bondholders, and the financial interests, which are ultimately not disturbed, but rather made uncompetitive and cartelized under a heavy regulation. In other words, all these institutions, instead of being abolished, are being basically nationalized. The family becomes national property. Big business becomes the property of the whole nation, not stockholders. The banks, are serving, the country at large. Labor unions are a similar situation. And so it is with institution after institution. Ultimately, fascism is a socialistic style arrangement that doesn't attack the foundations of the bourgeois social order itself. And surprise, it turns out to be gigantically successful, all throughout the 1930s, whereas widely considered that there was this big contest in the world. Laissez-faire had failed after the Great Depression, and it was no longer considered a viable, respectable idea that you just let people be free. We had to make a choice. We had to choose between socialism on the one hand and fascism on the other. And every responsible, respectable voice in Christendom, so to speak, favored fascism. This is why all throughout the early 1930s, you saw respectable opinion become wildly in favor of Mussolini. A very famous New York Times Magazine cover story on Professor Mussolini that was just a hagiographic in its adoration of the brilliant central planner Mussolini. One of my favorite books that came out, I think it was 1934, is called The Planned Society, put out by, I think, Harvard University Press, edited by Harvard economists and sociologists and historians, with a chapter by Mussolini himself. Mussolini considered to be the greatest living practitioner of the fascist ideology. So fascism was not an unrespectable perspective. It was considered to be the thing that you would want to adopt if you wanted to avoid the dire fate of socialism. It was something that was seen as a brilliant alternative to socialism. So if you were anti-socialist, you would rally around fascism as a way of forestalling, something like a dreadful upheaval that socialism would truly represent. And it really wasn't until U.S. entry into World War II that fascism became, an unrespectable position, a curse word, something that we as Americans were suddenly against. Never mind that it's actually very difficult to distinguish between Nazi-style economic policy, Italian-style economic policy, Spanish-style fascist economic policy, and American economics policies throughout the 1930s. They're all copying from each other, adopting each other's agricultural policies, industrial policies, policies towards labor, policies towards trade, you name it. It was all pretty much of the same piece, the same stuff. It's just suddenly, because of wartime, because we're us and they're them, and we're fighting them, that suddenly they became the bad guys, and fascism took on this terrible name. And so it was after the war. Fascism remained like a curse word. The U.S. is allegedly responsible for having vanquished this evil ideology from the planet. Never mind that U.S. economic institutions look very much actually like German and Italian and Spanish, economic policies before the war. They remained so after the war. There was a little bit of a loosening up that occurred. So in the midst of all of this comes this great treatise by John T. Flynn, 1944, called As We Go Marching. And what he's trying to draw attention to is the fact that the U.S. is going to war against this evil fascist threat abroad, meanwhile imposing these same fascist principles at home. I mean, after all, we're talking about 1944. This is the middle of the war. Wages are controlled, prices are controlled. There's massive rationing of food taking place. All of industry had been cartelized and designed to serve the war effort. There was no free enterprise left. I mean, people were being jailed left and right for violating labor controls and wage controls. And there's gold was being collected from Americans in the name of the national interest. And people were encouraged to buy war bonds to fund the state. The central bank is inflating like crazy to fund the war. It was a fascist-style economic policy, and Flynn called it out through a very mighty and brilliant treatise that investigated fascism as an ideology, as a particular ideology. It's not socialism as we've come to know it. It's something different that has a quote-unquote right-wing flavor to it, meaning it's pro-family, pro-corporation, pro-business, pro-status quo, all about the institutions that the bourgeoisie truly love, but trying to turn them to serving a big collective interest. Now, the only difference really, and Flynn points this out, between German and Italian-style fascism is that Hitler put a particular tweak on fascist ideology that was racial in tone. Rather than just being about one's national identity, Hitler wanted to make it about the Aryan peoples. We're suddenly the new nation, and there's all these people in Germany that fell outside of that. Namely, non-whites and Jews, of course, who he considered to be non-Aryans. So his particular variant of fascist ideology was peculiar to Germany. But fascism itself does not have to be anti-Semitic. I mean, that's not a necessary part of it. It just happens to be historically associated with fascist ideology. Although I do think you'll find a strain of anti-Semitism in all forms of fascism today. You found it then, you'll find it now. So, and in the course of his narrative, he actually lists something. It's a very careful study in many ways. Historically sophisticated, biographically in depth about Mussolini in particular, and avoids finally calling FDR an outright fascist dictator. But you get the sense of it. I mean, you get the sense of what he's doing. sometimes I wonder about books like this, and you could say this about Rose Walter Lane's Discovery of Freedom, Isabel Patterson's God of the Machine, Road to Serfdom is another one that came out about the same time, and so on. Omnipotent Government by Liberty.me. There's a whole slew of these amazing books that came out, between 1942 and 1945, basically during the war. Sometimes I wonder if they pulled back from their rhetoric just to get past the wartime censors, and the censors were very, actually, severe. In the original edition of As We Go Marching, on the back of the book it says, "This book is approved to be printed by the National War Planning Board," something like that, and included an advertisement to buy war bonds. So that's actually on the back cover of the original edition. As quite interesting, right? Well, so now I would like to kind of like fast forward, because I do think that this topic may be the most salient topic in American life today. As I said at the very outside, it's very possible that the right wing in American politics, and I would say this is true for libertarians too, have been distracted for the better part of 100 years by the great threat of socialism. We argue against socialism. It's our black beast, our bête noire that we always argue against. We uphold and go, oh, if we take these policies on, we'll become socialistic. Road to Serfdom is all about the gradual steps towards socialism. We all are radical anti-socialists in our hearts, right? Certainly that was my formation, the fear of the Reds. Fear of the Reds. And of course, it's very easy to adopt this perspective because, anybody who's been college educated knows that like half the faculty or 2/3 of the faculty is basically Reds. I mean, they all have Red sympathies, and we loathe them. We're disgusted by them. And a red style, Soviet style, red left-wing socialism represents in many ways the apotheosis of everything we loathe in this world. But what if we have been excessively distracted by the red menace for the better part of 100 years, even as the brown shirts represent a more clear and present danger? Not the Reds, but the Browns. What if in all of our anti-socialist agitation, we've permitted this variant, a right-wing variant called fascism, to rise up among us? And we've been afraid to call it out because the word itself has been discredited, and we've been not sociologically and culturally prepared in some way to recognize the threat when it's around us immediately. And I've toyed with this thesis because I think there's something to it. In American politics today, I think in many ways, we do face a choice between the Reds and the Browns. The Democrats representing a much softer version of a kind of Fabian style socialism, but not actually aspiring to nationalize industry. I mean, people used to say this about Obama, that Obamacare was taking us closer to socialized medicine. Well, not really, actually. It was never really a socialist economic reform, healthcare reform. It was always a little bit. It was always in favor of the private insurance. It never actually sought to abolish private medical care. It just wanted to bring it under kind of a regulatory structure to serve the national interest. Single payer style socialism that the left likes to talk about was actually never on the table. Obama never favored it. His Obamacare is basically a brown-shirted style policy, because that's what the bourgeoisie are much willing to go for. Red-style politics are never attractive. But still, I would say the Democrats represent a kind of red-tinged political thing. But what about the Republicans? I mean, here you have the real embodiment of, and I don't mean every Republican. I certainly don't want to say this about, the Pauls or, there's many good Republicans out there, just like there's some good Democrats too. But just in general, the ethos of the party, it's not against private property, but it is in favor of the dominant portion of the ruling class that funds the Republican Party, which is a corporate interests, banking interests, the war machine, which has always been a crucial feature of fascism, as Flynn points out. And also its cultural policies are very interesting to think of. Always pro-family, favor of religion. You know, you get the impression from listening to Republicans talk that Christianity is on the verge of being abolished, that the family is under massive threat, all the time, which I don't mean to say it's not, but the nuclear family as it came to be conceived of in the 1950s as an ideal is certainly not under threat. The family is under threat for different reasons, mostly having to do with bad economic policies, but not just as a hard cultural attack. So you get sort of fascistic brown-shirted style politics emerging out of the Republican Party. I don't think it's correct to call all these policies left-wing. I think they are distinctively right-wing in the sense that fascism itself is distinctively right-wing. And again, the difference between left and right in this case is that the left has an agenda that's fundamentally opposed to the bourgeois way of life, and the right believes in nationalizing bourgeois forms of institutions and culture to serve a kind of patriotic, militarized national ethos. I mean, what they both have in common, of course, is a belief in the planned society, that you should not have laissez-faire. You shouldn't just let people be free to do what they want with no end in sight. Let society naturally evolve. No, there's a matter of conscious planning at the heart of both the Reds and the Browns. It's a different form of planning, but they both aspire to kind of a national ideal and want to use the state to achieve this. So in general, I would say that brown-shirted style policies are probably as much or a greater threat to the American way of life, certainly in the course of the 20th century. That's true. Socialism has never really been, a threat. It wasn't a threat of the Great Society. It wasn't a threat of the New Deal. It's not a threat now, really. The bigger threat are these corporatist style policies that market themselves as being organic to the American way of life. I mean, there's a way in which Soviet-style socialism eventually became fascistic too, under Stalin, after they abandoned Lenin-style internationalism. So these things can be mixed up. It's not such a clean line between the red and the browns. What I'm arguing here is that there is a distinctive style of politics that deserves the name fascism, that deserves the moniker right wing for specific ideological, philosophical, and historical reasons, and that as lovers of liberty, we should be as alert, if not more so, to the threat of fascism than to socialism. Now, let me just take this one step further, just slightly further, to complicate the picture a little bit more. And I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to approach this, but I'll just plunge right in. If you've been listening up so far and following my argument, you might ask yourself this question: which of the two, fascism, right-wing fascism, or left-wing socialism, is in fact a greater threat to prosperity and to your liberties and to your ability to live the good life? This is a serious question. It's something that you have to contemplate, I think. Socialism, as Mises said, can very quickly produce a living hell. It can produce massive privation. It has. It can produce famine, catastrophic social conditions where you dare not let your children go visit the neighbor for fear that they'll be eaten, for example. This is a very common problem under socialism, cannibalism. millions dead, turning the whole of society into a war zone of unspeakable human deprivation and suffering and oppression, as versus fascism, which is an inefficient, lumbering, heavily bureaucratized system under which people don't really have rights or liberties, but you're not ultimately robbed of the ability to feed your family, to worship God in the way you want to own things, to find a job. Fascism, for all of its evil and its ghastliness, I would say, is in the end less of a threat to our ability to live and a decent life in which we're provided for. In a sense, that makes it even more dangerous because it's ultimately not catastrophic. It can be violent, it can be terrible, it's certainly contrary to human liberty, but it doesn't represent that sort of civilization crushing, destroying threat that socialism really represents. So if you had one button to push, if you had two buttons in front of you, and you had to choose either socialism or fascism, you have to ask yourself, which would you choose? Yeah? It's an interesting question. That's the choice that the 20th century provided us. It's a very tragic and evil choice. We shouldn't have to do this. We shouldn't have to make these choices between two forms of evil. But if you had to, which is the greater evil? Which is the greater threat to you in your life? And I would say there's no question that socialism is the case. And it's for that very reason that in the course of the 20th century, the bourgeoisie, the lovers of liberty, and including even the liberal parties in many countries, have acquiesced to fascism in the face of the presence of the danger of a socialist revolution in time after time. It happened in Italy, it happened in Spain, it happened in Chile. I would say to some extent it happened to the United States. There was a real threat of a red takeover after the stock market collapsed in 1929. It happened in the UK, and to some extent it happened in Germany. Browns usually campaign against the Reds and terrify you with the prospect of having all the things you love in life taken away from you, or vote for them, support their kind of dictatorship, preserve the things you love, but just give up some of your rights and liberties for a false sense of security. So if you're faced with that practical choice, which do you choose? And I would say that most people would support fascism under those conditions. It's happened too many times in the course of the 20th century, and I would suggest to you that it's happened repeatedly in post-war American economic policy. People feared the Democrats so much that they voted for people like Richard Nixon and George Bush and George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, and some of my very good friends. Despite having, who's that guy who ran last time on the Republican ticket? I guess it was Romney. I never had much interest in him, but at the end of the day, people's fear of Obama was so intense that they supported even Romney. It was just this pathetic character. And I would suggest to you it's going to happen again, right? Let's assume that this guy Jeb Bush gets nominated again. I mean, there's not anything about this guy that's even slightly interested in laissez-faire capitalism, as as we saw, in the age of laissez-faire in the 19th century. I mean, it has no concern for this whatsoever. He's a big welfare state guy, a warfare state guy, regulatory state. But when faced with the prospect of Hillary Clinton, and after people watch the Democratic National Convention and see the freak show that inevitably is, people will come around. And in other words, people will embrace the regrettable option of fascism over the terrible fear of the red socialist menace. And for that reason, in a sense, especially, I don't know, we'll see what happens, right? By the way, I'm not saying that when people voted for Obama, they were voting for a red style economic policy. I think people voted for Obama because they were fed up with Bush and wanted something like a more humane foreign policy, especially in a more humane national life in general, which they did not get. But nonetheless, that's what the promise was. But the Republicans win, it'll be for this very reason. So I would just suggest that in a way, you know, a number of things. One is that the fascism is real. It's a real ideology. It lives among us. It's a respectable ideology. It's a worked out, coherent alternative to red style socialism that is a dreadful danger to human liberty in every respect. There's probably a greater threat to our liberties than red socialism. And so I would say that it's still with us. It's something we're carrying around with us. And in a strange way, it's even worse because we don't have a name for it. You can't just call Jeb Bush a fascist. You can say, oh, he's fascist, because it's not a serious comment, right? I mean, those words don't have any meaning. It just sounds like you're cursing. Well, in fact, it does have a meaning. But in any case, back to John T. Flynn. You know that he is a very interesting guy. He started off his career as a progressive. He wrote a really wonderful book called Graft and Business, which was a hilarious progressive era style attack on corporate graft and that sort of thing. Gradually came around to loathing the New Deal because he was an anti-fascist, ultimately, a champion, a laissez-faire champion of liberty, thought of himself as a true and genuine liberal. He was very at home with the liberals throughout the 19-teens. He never agreed with the income tax and that kind of stuff, but basically he was anti-war, against World War I, against censorship. He was an old-style progressive. Saw the New Deal as fascism embodied, and watched as history unfolded. First, the nationalization of the banks, the control of labor, the nationalization of labor unions, regulation of labor throughout the country, the creation of the Blue Eagle laws, which corporatized industry, and then inevitably and always, every time under fascism, the drive to war. Why? Because their domestic policies never really succeed. So war seems like the answer. That's the thing that's going to boost the economy, lower the unemployment rate. We're going to get a draft. We'll kill off the unemployed, nationalize industry, and rally the country through patriotism and love of home and hearth, towards fascist style economic policies. And this is what John T. Flynn saw. That's why he was the head of the American First Committee. He tried his best to keep us out of war. His activities in that respect led to his discrediting as a national figure, though he had already been a very famous journalist writing for the Saturday Evening Post. Big shot. His anti-war activities about World War I led to him being disgraced. So in the middle of the war, he wrote he wrote many great books. The Roosevelt Myth is the best book on FDR written by far. It's never been equaled, and I've read them all. It came out in 1956, I believe. I think that was his last really truly great book. The rest of it was just trash. But this book, As We Go Marching, is a book for the ages. It's a terrifying work. It's a work that's brutally honest about the truth, about a brown-shirted ideology, about fascist ideology, and the threat that it represents to you and me every day, not just in 1944, but in 2015 and evermore. In times where socialism is really not a threat, not old-style socialism, I don't think there's any prospect that it could ever come to live among us. Nobody's really talking about the nationalization of industry, the abolition of the family, all this nonsense that Marx talked about. Brown shirt ideology still represents a genuine and true threat in our time. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to look at the question box here. I'm sorry for going over, but we did have a little technical problems at the beginning, so I felt like I needed to kind of take you through the entire argument here. I'm going to the live button. I'm sorry if you've asked a question. I'll get there in just one quick second. Oof. Okay, here we go. Okay, I'm not seeing the chat for some reason. You're going. Okay, I am so sorry. I'm not seeing the chat. So I think I'll just have to call it a night. And if you did ask a question, my deepest apologies to you. Liberty.me can also post in the chat window here if there's anything in particular. I'm sorry for going on so long about this book. I do think it's extremely important. You know, you can download it from Liberty.me. Decades went by when this book was out of print. I brought it back into print. It's got a brilliant introduction by Ralph Raico. Have a look at it. Check out his argument and get very afraid. You know, let me just conclude with a couple of comments here. I've been toying around the last few days that you can divide all political ideologies into two camps. One which believes that the social order is a product of conscious, top-down, intelligent planning of one sort or another, where there's a definite end to the social order that we want to achieve, and we're going to use intelligence, resources, and power to achieve it. All those ideologies fit on one side. They're the left, they're the right, they're every kind of thing. It's just politics as we know it. On the other side is the true laissez-faire view. The view that the social order is a product of spontaneous action, that the intelligence of is system-wide. It's a brilliant system, but the brilliance is not embodied in any single mind. The brilliance is emergent out of the spontaneous interaction of individuals, where the invisible hand truly does lead society to a destination, no particular destination, no final destination, but along a course of events that's ultimately unpredictable. As intellectuals, that's a very difficult thing for us to come to terms with, that intellectuals themselves are not in charge of the social order. The social order should be in charge of itself. That is, I think, the true laissez-faire position. And it's the one that we have to embrace and be ever on the lookout for the former kind of system, whether they come from the left or from the right. But probably in the scheme of things, I would just suggest that we're insufficiently aware of the danger to human liberty that emerges from the right, precisely because it tends to enter into our national life under such a disguise that always disguises itself as patriotic, pro-family, pro-religion, in favor of the life that we want. So, and that's where the true danger lies. Well, I'm sorry for not being able to take your questions. We'll get the technical problems worked out next week. Here we are a year into this, and we still haven't figured it all out yet. Yeah, so anyway, let's just be grateful for the miracles we have, the fact that I can come to you in this setting at all, and leave it at that. All the best, and thank you for being a wonderful member of Liberty.me. Just keep posting, keep reading, stay engaged, and stay on the right side of history, my friends. All the best to you. Night, night.